Structure of verb phrase. So now let's look at the structure of the verb phrase, that how we can find a verb in different forms. Verbs have distinctive word phrase shapes, morphology obviously. We have discussed a lot about morphologies of words, noun, verbs, etc. The verb heads a verb phrase. So whenever we find a verb phrase, the head of the verb phrase is always a verb. The verb can be preceded within the verb phrase by auxiliaries and modal verbs and the negation word not. So if you look at the verb phrase, you can find that there is the possibility of an auxiliary verb coming before a head word, which is a verb, or a modal verb, or not, even not. So let's look at these different shapes. The verb phrase is usually preceded by a noun phrase called the subject. A sentence represents an action or an event or a state of affairs. In many cases, the verb is the word which names the kind of action or event or a state of affairs. English verbs have two distinctive morphological characteristics. One, the shape of the verb can encode the tense of the sentence. So, for example, he plays cricket. We see that the plays has an S, so it can tell us the tense, that it's a present tense. Similarly, he eats meat. Eats can tell us that it's a present tense. And he ate meat. Ate can tell us it's a past tense. So the morphology of the verb can tell us tense. The second special morphological characteristic is that an English verb can agree with its subject if the verb is present and the subject is third person singular. So he plays. So plays must agree with the third person singular subject, that is he. She plays piano well, so plays must agree with the subject she. The first grammatical form that can appear in a verb phrase in English is the auxiliary verb. So in English, the 12 auxiliary verbs are have, be, to, and the 9 modal verbs can, could, may, might, must, shall, should, will, etc. Auxiliary verbs perform the function of progressive, perfect, passive, operator, and modal within verb phrases. So we know that we cannot use the verb as a main verb, especially if it is a non-finite verb like to work, like working or written, unless we have is or we have etc. with it. So to make a progressive writing, we have a verb writing, present participle form of the verb. So to use it as a verb, we need is, for example, or was or were, etc. to make it a progressive verb. Or we need, if we have written, we need a perfective. To make it a perfective, we need have, right? Or has. So progressive auxiliary verb, the dog was barking. So we know that we have made this progressive barking with the help of auxiliary verb. Was, perfect auxiliary verb, we have made this perfective verb completed with the help of have. Passive auxiliary verb has been as is added to return. Operator auxiliary verb, please do call me. Modal auxiliary verb, study, will study. Progressive, perfective, passive, and modal auxiliary verb may appear with other progressive, perfective, passive, and modal auxiliary verb. So we can have not one auxiliary verb, we can have more than one auxiliary verbs alone or with modal verbs. The order in which auxiliary verb can appear together is modal, perfect, passive, progressive. For example, we have perfect, progressive. Had is the perfective and been is the progressive. Been, perfective, both are perfective, and progressive is sleeping. So we have had been sleeping. Similarly, has been broken. Perfect, passive, modal, progressive, could and be. And modal, perfect, might, have, and passive, been, modal perfect and passive, been and progressive, being. So these are different forms of verbs that we find very frequently when we use or make sentences. So you look at the different structures of verbs. When we look at a sentence, we can have a subject and a predicate. Predicate consists of a verb and it may have complement like object or other adverbials. Make sure that you become familiar with these sentences. John searched the room. So if you look at this, search is the verb and room is the direct object. So search is the type of the verb which takes a direct object. But the second sentence, the girl is a student. So a student is not an object of the verb, is because is a linking verb, right? It does not, or it's a type of intransitive verb. It does not take an object. It always takes a subjective complement, right? Similarly, his brother grew happier. Grew is the verb and happier is the subjective complement. If you look at the next sentence, it rained steadily all day. So it means that rain cannot have, a verb like rain cannot have an indirect object, a direct object, or a subjective complement or objective complement. It can simply have an adverb. He given the girl an apple. So if you look at this had given verb has an indirect object and a direct object. And the last sentence, they make him the chairman every year, right? So we have a indirect object, him, and then we have objective complement, the chairman, and an adverbial, every year. So these are different types of sentences. All these complements are dependent upon the verb. That it is the verb that determines that it is to take a direct object or an indirect object along with a direct object, and an indirect objective complement along with a direct object, or an adverb, right? So understanding different forms of or shapes of the verb is very important.